नमस्कार।
नमस्कार।
आपका क्या नाम है?
दीपिका।
दीपिका। नाइस टू मीट यू।
फिर उठ के सबसे पहले यही काम होता है हमारा।
I'm Chavi Sachdev, and you're listening to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. Deepika is a salt farmer here on the outskirts of Bhavnagar, a town in the state of Gujarat on the west coast of India. We are standing in the blazing heat amidst 5 different sized fields of salt water. This is her salt farm, and it covers 10 acres. Can you tell me what your process is?
सुबह उठते जल्दी 3 बजे।
She wakes up at about 3:34 in the morning, early in the morning.
गर्मी तो 9 बजे से ही लगने लगती है।
तो उससे पहले खत्म करना
हाँ,
पड़ता है।
उससे पहले काम खत्म हो जाए तो और अच्छा है, वरना
Okay, so they aim to finish by 9 o'clock because it's too hot after 9 to be outside and they feel really hot and they get heat stroke and faint. So they start early.
ये पूरा चलाने में 4 घंटा तो लग ही जाते हैं इसमें। इधर से वहाँ तक।
She's telling me that it takes her at least 4 hours, sometimes 4.5 hours, to rake the salt in these pans. So how long does the whole process take to turn seawater into salt?
बहुत से बहुत 10 दिन में तो पक जाता है।
10 days
हाँ,
to just
10 से 12
to
दिन हो
crystallize
जाते
it. And then the water is pumped out and then the next one takes 10 days.
खुद की है,
Okay.
ये जैसी तैसी चलती है।
They have their own tractor that they use to take the harvest, but it doesn't work that well. She says they have to push it and make it go somehow. As you can hear, salt farming is hard, hot work. It takes Deepika's family, her husband, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, and her 8 hours of raking through the hot, salty, ankle-deep water each day to keep the salt crystals from clumping while the water evaporates, until all that's left is salt to be scooped up and trucked away, eventually making its way to your dining table. Salt holds an important place here in India's history. Breaking British laws on salt production was the first act of civil disobedience led by Gandhi that would eventually lead India to independence. Today, India produces 1/3 of the world's salt, and nearly 75% of that comes from here in Gujarat. So, why am I here? Well, because we've received a lot of salty science questions in the Crowd Science inbox, and we're tackling a couple of them in this episode. We'll come back to salt farming and getting salt out of the water later in the program, but listener Julie's question is about how salt got into the sea.
Hi, my name's Julie and I'm from Auckland, New Zealand. My question is, why is the sea salty? Given that the rivers that flow into them are fresh water, I don't think rain is salty. Lakes are fresh and some lakes are as deep as some seas. So why are the seas salty?
That is such a great question. And do you live near the sea?
Auckland is a narrow isthmus, so to get to the sea in one direction is probably 5 minutes driving, which goes straight to the Waitemata harbour. And if I drive in the other direction, it's about 10 minutes to get to the Manukau harbour, which goes to the Tasman Sea.
Amazing. So I also live by the sea. I'm in Mumbai. We've got salty water quite a ways around us because we're a peninsula. I have never wondered that question, so I'm very happy to dig into it and find out.
Wonderful.
Sifting for Julie's answer took us to a lake, nowhere near the ocean. Julie mentioned lakes are fresh, not salty, but that's not always true.
We're at the southern boundary of the Great Salt Lake, which is in northern Utah, right outside of Salt Lake City. It's nestled between many different mountain ranges, and it is the saltiest lake in the Western Hemisphere.
This lake in America is 5 times saltier than the ocean, and it's a microcosm of how salt gets into the sea. So it may hold some answers for us. Our guide here is a PhD candidate in geology and geophysics at the University of Utah.
My name is Mark Radwin. I look at the landscape evolution of the Great Salt Lake and the Bonneville Salt Flats, thinking about how it's been changing and how it might continue to change in the future.
We wanted to see some of the salt this lake holds. Mark's with Crowd Science producer Sam, looking for it the old-fashioned way, with our eyes and noses.
With the lovely smells.
What is that smell? It's kind of
Sulfury things. Mirabolite being a sulfur mineral or sulfur-based mineral it can cause that smell once it like gets oxidized by natural conditions, and kind of makes that funny, rotten egg smell.
Mirabilite, one of the many types of salt we're trying to spot here on the lake's shoreline. And with a bit of luck, Mark and Sam happen upon something.
It's a big pile of multiple different salts. And this is all coming out of a spring, so some water's coming up through a hole in the ground. Looks like this is a long-standing mound that has slowly been evaporating out, and you get these interesting stacks of all these different salts. There's at least 3 different salts here in this mound that we're standing on.
So we've got some like crystal looking little structures here. I don't know, maybe the size of your thumb or something. What are these? Is this salt?
This is salt. This is not typical table salt, though. It's a salt we call mirabilite. And this is a common salt that forms in the Great Salt Lake area. It's made out of sodium, just like table salt, but instead of having chloride, sodium chloride, it's actually sodium sulfate, so SO4. And it makes these transparent crystals that you can find in these little mounds, and they actually can like melt in your hands. They're really cool.
Salt, as you've heard, isn't just the sodium chloride that we sprinkle on our food. That's the kind that makes up most of the salt in the ocean, 90% in fact, but salts can be made up of various different elements, and this lake contains a lot of them. Most lakes are freshwater, not salty at all. So what's going on here?
This lake is in a closed basin, so it can't flow out to the ocean, doesn't flow out anywhere else. And that's really important for why it gets so salty, because the only way water can escape is through evaporation. So most of the large accumulations of salt in the world were once some inland sea, some large body of water that had to evaporate away completely to leave all that salt behind.
The Great Salt Lake is so salty because, unlike rivers or freshwater lakes where water is constantly flushing out to the oceans, any salt that gets in here is stuck. Water can escape by evaporation, but the salt is left behind. What listener Julie wants to know, though, is how does all this salt get into the water in the first place?
Nearby rocks, as the rivers and as the rain is in contact with all these rocks, and as that rain and river water comes into the lake basin, it dissolves elements from the rocks, and those are what get put into the water. The landscape isn't extra salty or anything like that, so you'll find this all over the world where, independent of the rock type around it, you can find salty lakes.
So this is an example of a really ancient salt. This is from New Mexico, Permian salt, so 225 million years ago.
Brenda Bowen is a professor of geology and geophysics at the University of Utah and Mark's PhD advisor. In her office, she's showing us various salts she's collected over the years.
Here's one that is actually from a salt lake in East Africa, in the East African Rift. And this is a really cool salt. It's actually called Magadiite. It forms in Lake Magadi. It's really beautiful with, all these stripes. It kind of looks like toothpaste oozing up. And this was actually forming along fractures in the lake bottom, that the minerals that can grow from the brine. I have another sample over here. This one's crinkly. Yeah, so that is a piece of halite crust from the Bonneville Salt Flats. So actually this grew as a crust on the surface like this, and the crystals are growing down from the uppermost surface into the brine through time. And so then we reached down and plucked it up. And so you're looking at it upside down here and can see those beautiful cubic crystals.
This piece of salt is from the nearby Bonneville Salt Flats, once part of the same giant lake, Lake Bonneville, that covered a huge area, including what's now the Great Salt Lake. Earlier, Mark told us that salt gets into the water from rocks, and that's also how it gets into the ocean or any body of water. We asked Brenda to explain the chemistry in this process.
Salt forms and accumulates on our planet because of the water cycle and water that falls as rain and snow. And as it travels through the atmosphere, it picks up a little bit of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and becomes slightly acidic. So that then when it falls on rocks and the surface of the planet, you end up breaking down the rocks and get weathering and erosion.
The main salt in seawater and salty lakes is sodium chloride, what we know as regular table salt. There are other minerals besides this which are released from rocks during erosion, but not as many of them find their way into bodies of water.
So you have waters that are flowing over the surface of the earth, and rocks are made up of things like sodium and calcium, magnesium, potassium, and then chlorides and sulfates and other ions. A lot of those materials get used up in other biogeochemical cycles as nutrients for plants or animals, or they form new types of rocks like clays or other types of minerals. But sodium and chloride stick around the longest. They're the ones that don't get used up in some of those other biological processes.
While sodium chloride might be the most abundant at the end of the eroded rock's journey, some other salts do make it into the sea. And one of those less common salts actually gave oceanographers a crucial insight into the saltiness of the sea.
People had realized after about 100 years of studying oceanography that the balance of the salts didn't work, that we had all this water flowing into the oceans. It was running off the continents, rivers were carrying salts through estuaries and into the oceans, and we didn't know where they were all going, and we didn't know why the earth wasn't just getting saltier and saltier. And so there had to be something that had to be taking some of these elements back out.
This is Chris German, a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts. Oceans maintain a salinity level of about 3.5%. But one thing mystified scientists. If the salts that wash out of the rocks are continually flowing into the sea, why didn't the oceans keep getting saltier, just like the Great Salt Lake? That's where one of the less common salts offered an important clue.
One of the salts that is particularly out of balance is magnesium sulfate, or Epsom salts. There's way too much magnesium being washed into the sea that it could be accounted for with anything else we know about, things like sort of biology or in salt flats. So we knew there had to be some other mechanism that was taking magnesium out of seawater.
Meanwhile, in the 1970s, oceanographer John Edmund had observed some water bubbling up from the seafloor that was just a bit warmer than ordinary seawater. It also had a slight magnesium deficiency.
And then he published something that seemed like an outrageous interpretation of the data.
Based on the slightly warm waters coming out of the seafloor and the amount of magnesium they lacked, Edmund did some calculations and came up with a prediction.
He said, I can predict that there must be fluids out there somewhere at the bottom of Earth's oceans that are somewhere around 350 degrees Celsius or hotter. So a lot of people were just like, you must be crazy, you can't possibly imagine there is such a thing. And 2 years later, they discovered them. It was a different group, were working in a different part of the world's ocean and found things, and they measured them, and they were actually 362 degrees Celsius. So if anything, he slightly underestimated.
The things they found were hydrothermal vents, which are exactly what they sound like. Gashes in the seabed spewing out extremely hot water and minerals from below the Earth's crust with great pressure, like a fire hose. Chris now leads expeditions to find the many and varied types of hydrothermal vents that exist out there.
As I've continued to explore, not only have I kept finding new hydrothermal vents around the world, but I keep getting surprised and humbled by the fact that there's an even wider diversity of hydrothermal sites than even I anticipated. Even as recently as last summer, we were finding new kinds of hydrothermal vents that nobody had ever seen before.
Black smokers, white smokers, and snowblowers are some of the names given to hydrothermal vents because the minerals they eject usually form large, billowing chimneys above them. The main difference between the types of vents Chris is talking about is their chemistry, what they're spewing out and what they're taking in. But what remains the same is how they work.
It seems to be that the water, basically, it percolates downwards and it gets warmer and warmer. So beneath the seafloor, The deeper you go, the hotter the rock becomes. And so water can percolate down over large areas very slowly into the rock. So it can take maybe a couple of years for water to actually reach the point where it's at its hottest and it's buoyant. But then once it gets to that point, it only seems to take about an hour to come back out.
Wow. And where does salt fit in here? Is salt one of the compounds that's coming out?
So the seawater that goes down is about a 3.5% sodium chloride solution. And one thing we have noticed is that the total amount of salt can actually vary in hydrothermal vents when they come back out. Sometimes it comes out as more salty and sometimes it comes out as less salty. And what that allows us to deduce is that there's actually a different thing that happens, which is called phase separation, which is kind of complex, but basically what it allows a very concentrated salty brine to condense from the water. That's probably the explanation is why sometimes we see hydrothermal vents that can have fluids that are up to twice the salt content of the original seawater.
But if these vents are releasing extra briny plumes, why don't the world's oceans get even saltier? It's a young science and still something of a mystery, but the answer may have to do with hydrothermal circulation, the movement of water through the deep ocean crust.
If you have this underwater high pressure boiling effect called phase separation, that maybe you're sequestering a lot of the salt in the rocks down beneath the seafloor, and maybe more of the hydrothermal vents are fresher than seawater rather than saltier than seawater. So the net balance is that it's actually taking salts out of the ocean and storing them in the rocks beneath the seafloor.
I see. So it's like a little bit of a give and take.
Yes, it's a yin and yang thing that the continents generate the salts and wash them into the sea. The ocean crust is something that helps take some of that salt back out again, and around the cycle goes again.
You're listening to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. I'm Chavi Sachdev, and today we're answering your questions about salt. So far, we've tackled Julie's question about why the sea is salty. We learned how the salt gets into the water and how it's regulated thanks to rain, rock erosion, and ocean vents. Back in Bhavnagar, one of India's salt manufacturing centres, it's 9 a.m. and already 36 degrees Celsius. That's 96.8 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm with salt farmer Deepika again, who tells me this work has been getting hotter and harder in recent years.
क्योंकि यहाँ पे काम करना बहुत मुश्किल पड़ जाती है
There's a lot of difficulties.
गर्मी से
गर्मी से.
हाँ.
So आपको लगता है कि 5-6 साल में गर्मी ज़्यादा हुई है?
हाँ
It's hotter in the last
हाँ.
5-6 years. Okay. बारिश वगैरह का कुछ असर हुआ है? Has the rain changed?
और बीच में कभी कभी होती है बारिश तो तकलीफ पड़ती है सबको
So she says there is unseasonable rain.
એને અસર તો થાય જ ને અમારું મીઠું બગડી જાય કામ નો હાલે
The
પછી
salt gets spoiled, work stops.
હા
Okay. Oh, that is a shame. I traveled down the road to meet Prasann Khemka, who owns Chandan Salt Works, a 710-acre industrial salt operation which produces 1,000 times more salt than Deepika rakes in salt crystals. Instead of harvesting edible salt like Deepika does, his operation produces salt for industrial purposes.
We majorly supply to all the chlor-alkali industries in India. These industries, they manufacture caustic soda and soda ash.
And where does caustic soda and soda ash end up in our listeners' lives?
Soda ash is used as a raw material to manufacture washing powder and detergent. Caustic soda, it is used in many things like the textile industry, they use caustic. There are more than 400 uses of caustic.
Like Deepika's small farm, this industrial salt works is also facing business losses as weather patterns shift.
This year, I could just harvest 2 crops, not third crop, because now rainy season is near.
And it's humid.
Yeah, and it's humid, and maybe by 15 June, the monsoon may come, so I cannot take the risk of opening the new pens and harvesting, because if there is rain, the salt will dilute.
It's clear to see the huge impact that diluted salt has on these salt farmers, an increasing problem as the climate warms. And another of our listeners, Will, is wondering whether the seas themselves will get diluted due to climate change.
Actually, I live pretty much the furthest place from the sea in England. It's right in the middle of the country.
And what is your question for Crowd Science?
Well, I'm worried because the melting ice caps is clearly going to reduce the salinity. Is that going to have any effect on the weather or the wildlife or anything like that? I have no idea if the ice caps are going to put in a tiny bit of fresh water or a lot of fresh water.
Climate change in the Arctic and elsewhere is adding more fresh water to the oceans in the form of giant walls of melting glaciers carving off into the ocean. So what does this mean for the world's oceans? Is Will right in thinking all that melting ice will dilute its saltiness?
The oceans have an average salinity of 35 grams per kilogram of water. And so salinity varies between around about 32 grams up to around about 38 grams per kilogram.
And how much is 32 grams? So is that a teaspoon? Is that 5 teaspoons?
Yeah, I've never thought about ocean salt in teaspoons. It's a very good question. I really don't know. I might have to go downstairs and measure some salt and see how much teaspoons, 35 grams would be.
We checked. It's about 5 teaspoons per kilogram of water.
My name's Paul Durack. I'm an oceanographer by training, actually, an Australian, as you can probably hear in my accent. And I've been based in the US researching climate change in the ocean since 2011.
And where in the US are you now? You're on the Pacific.
That's right. So I'm on the West Coast in California, based out the back of San Francisco, actually. So Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory.
All right, so you're clearly in a good place to talk to us about the world's oceans, literally. So for our listeners, we are trying to find out about the oceans becoming fresher. I mean, the oceans are pretty big.
They're very big.
Is the amount of fresh water that's melting into them enough to have an impact on the overall salinity of the oceans?
Our observing network for the ocean is not as comprehensive as we have over land. So we don't have a good enough observing system to answer the question of how much is the global salinity changing. But what we do have is regional information, which then gives us this insight, such as, a freshening Southern Ocean, for example. And that environment's actually pretty sensitive to fresh water flowing into the ocean if it doesn't get mixed by winds.
Scientists have found out that the Southern Ocean, which surrounds Antarctica, is getting fresher. Evidence for listener Will's hunch that ice melt will make the oceans less salty. But evaporation and precipitation also play a part, a bigger one, in fact, when it comes to the global picture.
The patterns of evaporation and precipitation at the surface of the ocean actually then sets up what the salinity looks like underneath it. So there's a very tight relationship between regions of the ocean that have more evaporation than rainfall, and they're generally salty. And then there's other parts of the ocean that have more rainfall than evaporation, and they're fresher. And then what happens is that the ocean circulation responds to the places that are salty and the places that are fresh and tries to balance all of the gradients so that the ocean is much more even.
Climate change is melting ice on a worrying scale, but it's also having a dramatic effect on evaporation and precipitation, throwing off the global water cycle.
As a rule of thumb, we consider for every degree of warming has about a 7% increase in the amount of evaporation and precip. For every degree Celsius that we increase the temperature of the atmosphere, that atmosphere can hold 7% more water. And so that then leads to an enhancement of the water cycle.
And by enhancement, Paul means the water cycle is running on overdrive. The warmer air has a much larger capacity to hold water vapor, which means more evaporation, more precipitation, and a knock-on impact on ocean salinity. Paul tells me this is already playing out. For example, on both sides of the Indian Peninsula, in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea.
The Bay of Bengal actually has quite a fair amount of runoff from land, ice melting, etc., that flows into the Bay of Bengal, in addition to what's happening just with the evaporation and precipitation fluxes over the ocean itself. And the Arabian Sea is in an evaporative regime. And then eventually that will rain out not only over, say, the Bay of Bengal, but also over some of the land areas. And then through runoff, that will find its way back into the Bay of Bengal as well. And so consequently what's happening is as the world is warming up and the water cycle is amplifying, the contrasts that are naturally there in the background are actually amplifying. And this is leading then also to salinity changes, the Arabian Sea getting saltier and the Bay of Bengal getting fresher.
As Paul said, the Bay of Bengal on India's east coast is getting fresher, while the Arabian Sea on the west coast is getting saltier. Well, the salt farms I visited in Bhavnagar are on the west coast, where salt levels in the sea are rising. You'd think this would help salt farmers like Deepika. But, as Paul pointed out, the warmer atmosphere here is not just evaporating more water out of the Arabian Sea, it's also dumping it down on this region when it's not expected. I asked Prasann how things have changed in recent years.
Since last 5 or 7 years, I can say, the monsoon pattern has changed. So this has badly affected the salt industry because we have almost reduced our production all over Gujarat, you can say, more than 30%.
More than 30%?
Yeah, more than 30%.
It's a hard...
Yeah, it's a hard truth. If there is normal rain, it is good for salt industry. If there is extensive rain, it is bad for salt industry. And if there is less rain, that is also good for salt industry. But the extensive rain, the extended monsoon will always hamper the industry. And now as a salt manufacturer, we have to change ourselves so that we can get more production in this climate change.
A shifting monsoon season and unpredictable rainfall clearly impact annual salt harvests. The small-scale salt farmer I met, Deepika, told me that she's lost about 40% of her salt crop in recent years, and that's largely due to the turbocharged water cycle we've been hearing about, increased humidity and unseasonal rains. For our last stop today in Bhavnagar, I visit one place that's trying to help salt farmers navigate these uncharted conditions.
Presently it is low tide, so that wise we cannot see the sea water.
It comes up to here?
Yeah, it comes up to here, and now we come forward for the pumping station.
Oh yeah. So all across the vista, I can see hillocks of this salt, more salt work factories, again more salt, and if I just turn in a 360-degree loop, salt everywhere. And around me are dried up salt pans. This is all part of the experimental salt farm, 180 acres that belong to the Central Salt and Marine Chemical Research Institute. And I'm here with Dr. Bhumi Andaria, who's going to tell me about what their plans are to help small-scale farmers as well as big industrial salt farmers with climate change.
Earlier, rain was there. The monsoon season was fixed. June to October is monsoon season. But now what happens? That rain you cannot predict. Cyclones are also frequent. So this salt production is entirely in the open pans. So you cannot protect it with the roofs. It is not feasible. So it get diluted completely. Second, silt will come in the brine. So it will affect the quality of the brine. So they will not get good market value, because its whiteness get affected. Nobody will eat that type of dusty salt.
Bhumi and her colleagues use this experimental salt farm to test new salt harvesting methods that are more climate resistant. One of these innovations is to guide the flow of brine between the salt basins, especially when they start to flood. They use gravity and directional gates, as well as solar-powered pumps.
So starting from this pumping, this is energy efficient pumping system. Then this brine will be transferred through gates. So this is the mechanism. Further, most important aspect is to discharge the rainwater and flood management. So through this, in a monsoon season, generally salt production get stopped. But here we have designed in such a manner we will continue the salt production in monsoon.
Even these innovations won't protect against all the water coming in the wake of climate change and melting ice.
Actually, sea level is rising every year. All the saltworks are near to the coastal regions. So once the sea level will rise, it will be predicted that majority of the saltworks, some partial area will be submerged completely due to the sea level rise. So it is going to affect a lot to the salt industries, and major salt manufacturers, they are already worried about that.
Are they doing anything to mitigate this? Are you advising anything?
For sea level rise, we cannot do anything, because once it will be rise, no protection will work. But for flood level rise, we are working on that, and we are trying to implement that engineering and technologies with the scientific design in major salt works by raising the embankment according to the flood mappings.
Climate change is inescapable. Even more than the melting ice caps and glaciers, the unseasonal rain and evaporation patterns are affecting salinity in our water bodies and ultimately the salt we get from the oceans. Scientists like Paul, Chris, Mark, and Brenda are trying to understand how things work so scientists like Bhumi can help salt farmers adapt to the changing climate. I know this has certainly given me something to think about when I add salt to my chips or go for a dip in the sea. Now over to our listeners for the credits.
That's it for this edition of Crowd Science. Today's questions were from me, Julie in New Zealand,
And me, Will, in the UK.
If you have a science question, salty or sweet, that you'd like made into a program by the Crowd Science team, email
crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. This episode was produced by Sam Baker and presented by Chavi Sachdev.
Thanks for listening. Ka kite.